The following is a record of my experiences during the late memorable war between China and Japan. Without going into any detailed account of my earlier life, some few facts are probably necessary for the better understanding of the circumstances which led up to the events here presented. It'll be obvious that I can make no claim to literary skill. I have simply written down my exact and unadorned remembrance of incidents which I witnessed and took part in. I am the son of a Lancashire gentleman who accumulated considerable wealth in the cotton trade. He died when I was still a boy. I found myself, when I came of age, the possessor of upwards of £80,000. Thus, I started in life as a man of fortune. But it is due to myself to say that I took prompt and effectual measures to clear myself of that invidious character. Not to mince matters needlessly, I ran through that £80,000 in something short of 4 years. The pace was fast and furious. I threw out my ballast liberally as I went along, and the harpies, male and female, who surrounded me picked it up. Bright and fair enough was the prospect as I started on the road to ruin. Gloomy the clouds that settled round me as I approached that dismal terminus. Then, when too late, I began to regret my folly. About 11 o'clock one spring night of the year 1892, I was standing close to the railings of the Whitworth Park in my native city of Manchester. There came along towards me a man whose uncertain gait was strongly suggestive of the influence of alcohol. He was, it appeared, a sailor, a Lancashire man, and if he was to be believed, very respectably connected in Manchester. I gathered that he had ended a boyhood of contumacy by running away to sea. Having a week or two before come off a voyage at Liverpool, he had at that port drawn £75 in pay, which he had spent in 2 days and nights of revelry. On what trifles does destiny depend? My first impulse was to walk off without taking any notice of his shouts, and on the simple decision to stay and see what he wanted, turned the whole future. In the course of conversation, I disclosed to Charles Webster, such was his name, the desperate state of my affairs with the gloomy prospect they entailed. The remedy he proposed was drastic, and by no means unfeasible. Cut it all and go to sea, he said. You've enjoyed yourself while your money lasted, and what's the good of money but to spend? You've spent yours, now go to sea and earn some more. We reached Port Arthur on the 19th, and having obtained a pilot, entered the harbour. We found there only 2 of the vessels belonging to the defeated squadron, the Ping Yuan and the Quang Ting. The former did not seem much injured, but the latter had evidently suffered heavily, the port bow being partially stove, the upper works demolished, and the armouring tremendously battered and dinted. Nothing of interest occurred during the day and a half that elapsed before the departure of the dispatch boat. Punctual enough as to time, she steamed out of the harbour under cover of night with a Chinese agent and myself on board. Misfortunes are well known never to come singly, and so it was in my case. The morning after our departure was very foggy, and towards noon we had to slow down to less than half speed. Suddenly, without a moment's warning, a Japanese gunboat loomed through the dun vapour close to the port bow. A storm of balls swept the deck, and half of those upon it fell dead or wounded. One of the bullets cut off the peak of my cap with mechanical neatness, leaving the rest of the article on my head, though quite turned round back to front. Before anything could be done to increase our speed, a quick-firing gun plumped several heavy shots through us. The machinery was damaged. We swung round helplessly and were evidently fast sinking. We had 2 boats of no great size. One of them was knocked to splinters by the shot. The other we lowered as fast as we could. As many as it would hold got into it. The others jumped into the water, and within half a minute afterwards our vessel went down. I was awakened by my Chinese hosts, if so I may term them, in a haze of confusion. My clothes were quite dry already. I got into them and was escorted outside at once. The first thing I saw was a detachment of cavalry, mounted on little shaggy Tartar ponies. One of these I was invited to bestride, and a moment afterwards, without the possibility of explanations being either asked or given, we were en route. I was at once taken before the commandant, who with a few other officers and a secretary sat prepared to investigate the peculiar circumstances which had brought a fan kuei, or foreign devil, amongst them. The examination was long, and from the difficulty of understanding one another confused enough. I gathered that I was or had been under suspicion of being a Japanese spy in the minds of those before whom I had been brought. Suddenly, we heard a commotion and people screaming. Uncertain what was happening, we all got up and fled as we were certain it was the Japanese. I directed my retreat towards the dockyards with a view to getting round to the south part of the town as far as possible from the quarter by which the Japanese were entering it. The idea of a general massacre never entered my mind, and I only thought of getting back to my inn, there to stay until things quieted down. I was not long to be left undeceived. A deadly work of vengeance and slaughter had commenced. Down the panic-crowded streets, louder and louder as I advanced, came ringing the volleys of the rifle fire, the shouts of the infuriated soldiers and the death shrieks of their victims. I knew that all armed resistance had been broken, and as these sounds of terror increased, an idea of what might be imminent crossed my mind. There was a rush and hurry of fugitives all around me, and now for the first time I saw the Japanese soldiers in pursuit, pressing on the fleeing throng and using rifle and bayonet furiously on all and sundry, stabbing and hacking fiendishly at those who fell. I was knocked down in the rush and trampled upon, and it was some time before I could rise. A Japanese soldier was near me as I staggered to my feet and took aim at me with his rifle. The barrel was within a foot of me, and I struck it aside just in time to escape getting a bullet through my body. My brain seemed stunned by the horror of the scenes around me. I could hardly believe in the reality of what I was witnessing. The streets were strewn with dead and dying, while others in frantic terror fled in all directions. I had no idea what direction to take, as every road appeared full of peril. I instinctively sought for some place of refuge, but knew not where to turn. The Japanese soldiers, merciless and enraged, were everywhere, and their bloodthirsty work was being carried on with relentless fury. I managed, at length, to regain my lodgings, but even there, in what had seemed the comparative quiet of the back street where my quarters were situated, I found that the murderers had been before me. 2 or 3 of the poor wretches who had been sleeping in the lower rooms were already lying dead, bayoneted or shot down like dogs in their attempt to escape. In the room where I had spent the previous night, I found my landlord stretched on the floor, half dressed with a ghastly wound in his throat. There was nothing left to stay for. I hastened away, intending to make for the western part of the town, hoping that by taking a circuitous route, I might evade the attention of the Japanese troops. Before I had got more than 100 yards from the inn, I met another detachment of the Japanese. One of them aimed at me with his bayonet, but I managed to dodge the blow and ran into the nearest alley. I passed through several narrow streets, hearing behind me the clatter of soldiers' feet and the yells of the terrified inhabitants. I turned several corners and finally emerged onto a road that led to a part of the town I did not know. I counted myself fortunate to have escaped without injury. Days later, I found myself aboard the vessel known as the King Shing, which was of about 700 tons. She was built entirely of teak, and her skipper, or Tai Kong as he is called, alleged that she was more than 100 years old. She was of the ordinary build of junks, a high poop, several cabins beneath, a deep waist with a bamboo deck running across it. Her rigging was made of rattan and hemp. The sails were of matting which looked fragile but were in reality strong. Chung and I were shown into the principal cabin. It was low but clean and comfortable, after the manner of Chinese junks, the decorations consisting chiefly of bright-coloured paper, with little squares of red paper inscribed with Chinese characters pasted on the walls. Exhausted by exertion and anxiety, I was fast asleep within half an hour of stepping up the junk's side. I slept far into the day, and when I emerged found that she had been successfully floated off the bank and got out to sea without so far attracting the notice of the Japanese ships. The rest of the men on board, including the crew and soldiers, seemed to be in good spirits, although the risks were great. The junk was slow, and in the event of any encounter with Japanese ships, escape seemed unlikely. The weather was fine, but the wind dead ahead and we made little progress. We kept the coast in view, edging along towards the Gulf of Pichili, which it was proposed to make for. The Mandarin had recovered his spirits and was already giving orders, as if the little mishap in the flight had been of no consequence. Chung, who knew the waters well, seemed more concerned, saying that we were in the path of Japanese patrol boats. By noon, we were still close to the mainland and moving very sluggishly. I asked Tai Kong whether we had any better chance of speed later in the day, but he shrugged and muttered something about the wind changing. His face betrayed no particular concern, but the men, especially those who had served on the junk for many years, were uneasy. Suddenly, as the afternoon wore on, there came a sharp cry from one of the lookouts. Through the haze, just visible on the horizon, was a dark shape. At first, it seemed distant enough, but as the moments passed, the outline became more distinct, and it was soon evident that the shape belonged to a warship, most likely Japanese. Tai Kong showed no signs of panic, but ordered the sails adjusted and told the crew to make for the nearest bay along the coast. The men worked quickly, though I could sense their fear growing as the distant warship seemed to close the gap between us. The junk lumbered heavily as it turned towards the shore and a tense silence fell over us. Chung, standing by me, whispered, "If they sight us, they will attack. There is no escape." I felt a cold chill creep over me as I considered our chances. The junk was old, slow and heavily laden. There was little chance we could outrun or hide from a modern warship equipped with artillery. The men worked silently, the only sound the creaking of the rigging and the slapping of the sails against the wind. For over an hour, we watched the ship on the horizon, holding our breath with every minute that passed. Then, as if by some miracle, the dark shape began to veer off, moving farther from us, until finally it disappeared into the haze. A collective sigh of relief swept over the crew. Tai Kong gave a curt nod, as if to say it was nothing. But I could see that even he had been nervous. We continued our slow journey, hugging the coastline as much as possible. By nightfall, we had reached a sheltered bay where we anchored. The stars were clear above us, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. The danger seemed to have passed, at least for the moment. That night, as we sat in the dimly lit cabin, Chung and the Mandarin spoke of their plans once we reached Pichili. They were determined to evade capture and deliver their cargo of arms to the Chinese forces. It was a bold plan given the strength of the Japanese fleet, but I admired their resolve. The following day dawned bright and clear, and we resumed our slow journey along the coast. The mood on board was cautiously optimistic, though we all knew that we were still far from safe. The junk moved steadily, the sails full of wind, and for a time, it seemed as if we might avoid further encounters. Then, just before midday, another cry came from the lookout. This time there was no mistaking it. A Japanese gunboat was bearing down on us, fast and relentless. Panic spread through the crew, and even Tai Kong's calm demeanor faltered. He gave hurried orders to adjust the sails, but it was clear there was no escaping the inevitable. The gunboat was too fast, and we were too slow. Chung grabbed my arm. "We must be ready to fight." I looked around at the ragtag group of soldiers and sailors. They were armed, but their weapons were old, and they were no match for the firepower of a Japanese gunboat. The gunboat drew closer, and I could see the gleaming barrels of its guns pointed directly at us. The crew scrambled to prepare, but there was little they could do. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest as the reality of our situation set in. Just as it seemed that the gunboat was about to open fire, there was a sudden explosion. A plume of water shot up between us and the gunboat, and for a moment, I thought we had been hit. But then I saw the telltale signs of a torpedo. It had missed us by mere meters. The gunboat hesitated, clearly taken aback by the near miss. For a brief moment, chaos reigned on both vessels as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Then, without warning, the gunboat turned and sped away, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We stood there in stunned silence, unsure of what had just occurred. Chung was the first to speak. "We were lucky," he said. his voice trembling. The rest of the day passed in a daze. We continued on our journey, but the near disaster had shaken everyone on board. Even Tai Kong, normally stoic, seemed more cautious, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The sun was setting as we finally approached the Gulf of Pachili. The sight of the distant shoreline brought a sense of relief, but we knew that the hardest part of our journey was yet to come. The Japanese controlled the waters, and the risk of being captured was still very real. As night fell, we anchored just off the coast, too nervous to proceed in the dark. The Mandarin, Chung and I discussed our options in the cabin. The plan was to make a run for it at first light, using the early morning fog to cover our approach. It was risky, but it was our best chance. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The tension on board was palpable, and I could feel the fear in the air as we prepared for the final leg of our journey. At dawn, we set out. The fog was thick, just as we had hoped. The junk moved silently through the water, the crew working with quiet efficiency. It seemed as though we might actually make it.